Hey guys, BlackCross here, and yes, we're back again talking about the good old Final Fantasy VII Remake. However though, we're going to put down the main subject aside and go on to the real topic at hand. How is the rest of the series going to be? As of right now, it is unknown to us how they're going to take this process in hand when it comes to doing the rest of the parts. Keep in mind, this is going to be a multi-part series of Final Fantasy VII, and we are left hanging as to how they're going to go about the rest of the series. And quite frankly, some of us are mixed. Some of us are excited, some of us are a little bit worried, some to a degree. Especially after seeing multiple conversations being held between Tetsuki Nomura and the rest of the team itself. Before we go into the main topic in hand, I do want to go ahead and stress the fact that right now, Square Enix is trying to do some crowd control versus what Nomura is doing, which is to throw the audience completely overboard. What do I mean by that? Well, get a load of this. So Square Enix basically mentioned over and over again that Final Fantasy VII Remake is basically a retelling of the original story. So while that might be partially true, Nomura also decides to throw his little Nomura charm and basically throw people into a different loop altogether, including a comment that basically says the phrase, and I quote, "I can't quite tell you what the word remake actually literally means. You'll have to wait a few years from now." So that right there is a little bit of what you would call a counter swipe from what Square Enix technically said. Square Enix basically said, it's the original story except with higher quality graphics and a different gameplay style. Gameplay style? Gameplay style. And Nomura basically backhand them and basically says the phrase, "Bitch, this is my game. I'm gonna do whatever the heck I want." And it's like, yeah, I mean, he's the director, so any subtle changes he wants to make, he's gonna make them, including obviously that of the Whispers. So that means that the game could change in a different way, either for the better or for worse, depending on who you are. But either way, we're looking forward to seeing this, but there's also another situation that recently has come up to multiple people's venue, which is that of the process that they're going to take. They've talked about numerous times so far, and right now the current topic in hand is whether or not to develop the game in smaller portions or to make them in the same bigger portion that the first part took place. And this is rather confusing, and at the same time something that I think most of us don't know how to take this process in. On the one hand, yeah, we want to try to get the full experience as much as possible. It only makes sense that we would rather have the full package rather than in smaller portions, because if we get it in smaller portions enough as it is, it's not as momentum. We're not going to see anything major or anything memorable when it comes to these things. But at the same time, depending on what they actually cram into those parts, could depend on how long it may take for the game to be developed. So why not develop it in shorter portions, and that way they are released in a more sporadic way. For example, if they did it in smaller ports, perhaps we could see a Final Fantasy VII part within a year, and then a year after that, and a year after that, so on and so forth. Again, right now they are still within the planning stages of where they're going to go with Final Fantasy VII from here on out. So while we are familiar with how the original one goes, we don't know quite what Final Fantasy VII is going to be, as the team is going to be developing it from here on out. Now, of course, obviously some people are speculating that it could take a few years before we might see the next part, but here's the thing. The only reason why it took as long as it did for us to get the Final Fantasy VII Remake that we got today was because of a few hiccups that they've had to come along the way. One of those hiccups was, of course, they've had a different developer working on it entirely, a different offset from Square Enix main headquarters. They have a different company entirely working on a Final Fantasy VII Remake. And from what it sounds like, Square was not pleased with their decision of how they were going about the process, so they turned from the project, took it away from them, and basically gave it to the team that they have now, being the head director, being that of Tetsuki Nomura. So while yes, the team was also involved with making Final Fantasy 15 as well as Kingdom Hearts 3, they also contribute in making Final Fantasy VII Remake what it is right now. A lot of people worked hard on it. A lot of people were trying to figure out the process in which it went. Followed by the fact that they were also running it on a different system entirely. What do I mean by different system? Well, it's hard to say for sure because it's been kind of bouncing back and forth, but it was not on the Unreal Engine at the time. At the time, it was running on something completely different, and for some reason or another, they didn't like how it looks, so they shifted gears from that and put it on the Unreal Engine 4, where they had a clearer understanding and ideal of where they were going. Much like with Kingdom Hearts 3, they were originally running it on the Luminous engine, but changed gears because they didn't like how it looked, and thus changed it for the Unreal Engine 4, and apparently it was more appealing to Nomura's eyes. From what we've seen thus far with Final Fantasy VII, it was definitely a crowd pleaser, and it was very good, despite several setbacks that some people might have felt. But in my personal opinion, it definitely is the best that it can be, in my personal opinion, because imagine having just the normal game it is, with everything as is, placement, story, so on and so forth, is just the HD overall 4K resolution that we all want. Would we have acknowledged it and would we have appreciated better? Probably not. So that's why Tetsuki Nomura wanted to change it up. He wanted to give it a different meaning. He wanted to give it a better impact to players. He is contributed and as well as dedicated to delivering the best experience the game can be, both in storytelling and in gameplay. And in my personal opinion, he does a great job at it. It shows. Since technically it is now out, we're now looking forward into the future. And while yes, the settings may change, I don't think it's going to change that heavy. Allow me to explain. So Final Fantasy VII Remake, the first part, for the time being right now, we know that it's taking a chapter segment storytelling. It's a weird segment that most people have hit or miss on. It's a hit or miss because while some people hate it to a certain degree, people liked it because they're now adding a new feature to these chapter storytelling elements of Final Fantasy games, because now they have an option known as Chapter Select. Thanks to Chapter Select, now we can actually select a chapter and go back to previous areas rather than start from the very beginning, which is very nice to have, and especially for a game like Final Fantasy VII, which has numerous moments in different chapters, a lot of people can replay through a particular chapter and just still live that particular chapter because they enjoyed it, they fell in love with it, or if there's a particular side quest they want to go on, they can do that. If there's an alternate route that can be taken but has to be done in specific ways, instead of going through the whole game remembering what needs to be changed, you can go to specific chapters and just do what needs to be changed in order to get that segment completed, which is very enjoyable in my personal opinion. So I think rather than an open world feel that people would want to see in the next segment, I think we're going to see a chapter select. I think we will. I'm going to bet my money that it will be another chapter sequence storytelling. I know a lot of people hate that, but to get what we've got now, I think we're going to see that. I really do. Next, it's based on whether they do the elongated segment versus the short sporadic release versions. So technically, we're going to use the map of Gaia, being that of the overworld of Final Fantasy VII. We're going to look at specific locations as well as depth as to what is going on and depending on how far they're willing to go. So technically in the map of Gaia, we're going to mostly concentrate on 2 Pacific continents, because in my personal opinion, based on storytelling and depending on expansions of areas, could depend on how the spaces between the areas be. And in my personal opinion, I think the ending part for each area depends on the in-depth that they're going to go with. For example, if they're going to go for the long route, I believe that the main game will end at Nibelheim or Rocket Town, depending. I believe Nibelheim because that is really where the major storyteller actually goes from. It's not the end of Disc 1 in the original, but it is a major story turning point for the crew because they are revisiting Cloud's and Tifa's hometown, where the whole event happens. So I think it would make sense if something happened in Nibelheim that would make this turn of event, that would make it this climactic end game for the next sequence to begin, the third part. Now, of course, depending, we could also see the end segment if they do the shorter sporadic route, where it will end at the end of the first continent route, being that of going into hiding through the Shinra parade and riding a boat to the next continent. I think that's where we could see the end point, because technically in that encounterment we actually get to encounter Genova, and technically we did counter Genova in the first part, so I wouldn't doubt in my mind that we would see Genova again, a different part of Genova, mind you, but we would see Genova in the boat again. It just, to me, if they do that, it would be simulating a end boss sequence, in my personal opinion, I think. Now let's talk about the individual areas, okay? So this is where we're going to get interesting, because depending on story segment depends on how we're going to see the progression of development. This is something that I think not a lot of people are thinking about when it comes to the game itself. While yes, we would love to have the entire world of Gaia visible to play and have the entire world be our oyster, depending on how they go about it, I still believe they're going to go about this chapter segment storytelling. Because keep in mind, if we go back into previous segments, we can easily just go back anytime we want to and revisit those experiences. Again, I might be willing to be wrong, and I'm willing to say that I am 99% wrong, but I feel like they're going to go about another chapter segment storytelling for part 2, I think. It just, to me, it makes more sense, and I think that's just the route they're going to go. A lot of people won't like it, but they're going to go about it. So let's talk about the different areas. I think chapter 1 for part 2 is going to take place in both Midgar and Kalm. Now, why do I say both? Well, technically at the end of the remake, we see the new appointed president of Shinra, Rufus, taking position, and we see the main departments themselves lining up in front of Rufus. Obviously, they're going to make their plans known, and they're going to be starting plans on Neo Midgar. And thus, not only that, but also try to hunt down Sephiroth. Obviously, because Sephiroth killed the president, but also, too, because they might know that Sephiroth holds a key to this promised land that they are looking for. So while that's going on, we may also get an experience story through Kalm. Now, in the original game, Kalm was just a resting place as they go over there to stay after leaving Midgar. Cloud tells them the whole story of Nibelheim and basically tells what happened and everything like that, or at least from Cloud's perspective. So they might do a little summary explanation of what happened in Nibelheim. They might do that. So we might actually get to see a little bit of what you would call a tutorial level of what Final Fantasy VII Part 2 is going to be like. They may use that little segment to kind of show a level 1 sequence of Cloud with beginner materia and to showcase what fighting the enemies and stuff like that is going to be like, as well as to show the basic story structure that is going to be in Final Fantasy VII with Nibelheim. So I think Chapter 1 is going to be comprised of that. Chapter 2 is where things starts to go a little bit differently, where not only you go to the Chocobo Ranch, but you also go to the Mithril Mines. So why would I combine both areas for Chapter 2? Well, that's only because in Chocobo Ranch, you're only doing one thing and one thing only. To get permission to use a Chocobo, or to be taught how to catch a Chocobo. So, because of that, there's not much that needs to be done in Chocobo Ranch, but in Mithril Mines, I can imagine it being expanded to a certain degree. Now, why would you need a Chocobo? Because, unfortunately, to get across to the Mithril Mines, you have to either run really fast with a Chocobo, or you have to fight a giant snake monster. And this snake monster is so overpowered, as well as invested with poison. And so while technically you are carrying over save data from the first part, I imagine they would increase the monster's difficulty to a certain degree, so that way it would make it impossible just to get past them. And I imagine in terms of story segment, they would incorporate the Chocobo Ranch in some degree, where they might include an alternate monster known as the Chocobo Eater, Would they do that? I'm not sure, but I can definitely assure you that they might extend Mithril Mine, because in terms of storytelling, you meet up with the Turks again. And then of course the mine itself is a little bit elongated on its own, but I imagine they might do something about that in some regard. Now that's just one thing that they could do. The other one, and technically this is an optional area, and that is Fort Condor. Fort Condor is basically an optional area where you get to help these people trying to defend the phoenix that's living on this reactor. The bird itself is nested on top of the reactor, and it's basically there protecting its egg. So Shinra is trying to get the bird off of the reactor. So you, depending on the side quest, you want to help in some form of way. You want to contribute to help them. While technically this first part is optional, I wouldn't doubt if Square decided to make this as a main segment in order to introduce some kind of new boss or something, like some alternate giant machine that Shinra decided to develop in order to take on the Phoenix Bird itself, in which the party will defeat. As well as try to incorporate some new game mechanic involving assigning soldiers and stuff like that. That could be a possibility, I'm not sure. But the way that Fort Corridor is assessed, depending on how the team wants to go about it, may very well depend on if they want to include it or if they just want to extend it, depending. Again, it's an optional area up until Disc 2, but I imagine they might include it in some form of way in terms of the main story itself. Now, we get on to another segment part, which would be either the final part of Part 2, depending on if it's short-gated, or if it's long-gated, it could be the halfway point even, and which is Junyuan. Junyuan is basically a two-part town. You have the smaller town on the very bottom floor. Meanwhile, you have the upper populated city area at the top part, where the parade is taking place, in which you see Rufus as well as Hyinger taken aboard on the boat to get to the next continent to go after Sephiroth. And of course, this would be I would imagine it would be like a two-part chapter segment, because while you're at the bottom layer, you do interact with a boss, and this could be a perfect time to interact with the citizens of that lower area, as well as to do a couple of side quests. I think that could work, actually. I think that would be a perfect place to do a side quest in that area per se. Then after that chapter, the next chapter would begin as you're sneaking up to the top layer to where you can join into the parade involving the introduction of President Rufus, and thus try to board upon the boat, in which where the chapter would end after you defeat Genova and get to the next area, which is that of Costa del Solon. So depending on how they go about it, obviously the next chapter would be Costa del Solon, where basically the team encounters that of some Shinra members, some of them being on vacation and stuff, with a different, I suppose you could say, what you would say a fun segment storytelling. Not only that, depending on the situation, we may even get to see Tifa and Aerith in swimsuits. I doubt they would do that, but if they did alternative costumes for the audition with Corneo, I wouldn't doubt that they would incorporate an alternate bathing suit scene in which where that happens. That would be fun if they did. And if so, that would be a funny experience. It would be funny. You know, it wouldn't be offsetting. It wouldn't be weird. It would be funny. Because, again, you're seeing Shinra on vacation. You're seeing Hojo laying about in his lab coat talking to women, as ugly as he is because of being Shinra. Of course, he'd be a chick magnet. And then, of course, you might even get an encounterment with the Turks even. Who's to say even? You might even see Roach. That would be interesting to get a re-encounterment of Roach. And it's like he wants to challenge you, but he's like, nah, I'm on vacation, so go ahead. Again, it'd be a fun segment. It wouldn't be a in-depth segment, but it'd be a fun segment to encounter. May even get some optional side quests. Who's to say, really, you know? But that's where that chapter ends. And then we move on to the next segment, which is that of North Coral. Now, North Coral, the reason why you will want to go there is because it gives you entry access to the Golden Saucer. So while you do that, unfortunately Golden Saucer is a big area with a lot of different mini games and stuff of that nature. So I imagine that one would be a 2 to even a 3-part chapter, depending on how they do the progression of the area, or if they even extend it in terms of like area of effect or some kind of storytelling, you know? Again, you have the Golden Saucer part, but then at some point during the story, the team actually gets sent down to the bottom, which is that of course, the rest of Coral section itself. So, of course, you would go through a segment in which where Barrett relives his experience before he lost his arm and had a gun arm replaced, as well as his interactions and how Marlene and him got to meet up. We would see an extended story chapter in that part, and then they would probably end up going back to the Golden Saucer, in which where in order to get their freedom, they would have to participate in the Chocobo races. Again, this is kind of a theory ideal. I'm not 100% sure, but we could see another segment in which where Gungaga could be introduced. Now, if you don't know, Gungaga is actually a hometown to Zack. Now, the only people who would know who Zack is technically Aerith and Cloud. But of course, technically in the main game, technically you don't even know who Zack is. You just know Gungaga's there. And based on the chapter interaction, I imagine we could see an encounterment with the Turks again. Technically you do encounter the Turks in that part, so therefore we could see a battle segment happen with the Turks themselves, being that of Reno, Rude, and even Elena, possibly. We then go on to Cosmo Canyon. Now, it's gonna be interesting because Cosmo Canyon, before you go and do Cosmo Canyon, you get to interact with a random person. This is an optional character technically by this standpoint in time, but technically you can attain Yuffie during this portion. So Square could do a segment with Yuffie in which where you could attain her as a party member, but you have to go through a story segment in which where Yuffie steals your materia, you have to chase after her, and in some comical reveal, she gets tangled up with a monster that's got her tied up, and you have to save her, you know, depending on the dialogue choice. You can either choose to say, yeah, we'll save you, or you can say, I don't know, I don't think there's a reason to save you, and she'll panic and be like, I'll give you your materia, I promise, I'll give you all of it, and it's like, I think they could do that. I think they might do a story segment in which where an introduction to Yuffie would be in play. I think they would do that. And then of course we have Cosmo Canyon after that, and I don't know if they would extend anything in terms of area. I think Cosmo Canyon is good as it is, but they might do some kind of extension in terms of the caverns that would lead to the end segment. But as of right now, it's hard to say. And then of course we run across into Nibelheim, and that would be a humongous segment that they could probably expand upon. What was that of Cloud's hometown, as well as leading up to the reactor. So how much they can do, how much they could expand, who's to say really, but I imagine they could do something in some form of regard. And as well as some kind of end interaction in which where one of the monsters that are still in the reactor all of a sudden wakes up and turns into a grotesque boss, in which a super boss they would have to fight. I imagine that would be how they would do it. Now, they could go further and do Rocket Town to where they could have Sid, and technically by that point you would have all of the party members introduced, because you encounter Cassis in the Golden Saucer. You encounter Yuffie before the Cosmo Canyon area. Technically you encounter Vincent in Nibelheim in the Manor, and then of course Sid is in Rocket Town. But I don't think they would do that. I think they would hold off on Rocket Town, make Vincent as like a guest character. Again, this is assuming, this is not a guarantee, but assuming. We might see Vincent as a guest character towards the end of the game, and then by the beginning of the third part, depending on how they're going to go about it, we can then play as Vincent if we want to, and get an introduction to Sid. This is of course depending on how they want to do the next part. This is a theory, this is an ideal, this isn't even a guarantee, and I'm willing to accept that I am going to be 95 to 99% wrong about how they're going to go about it. But just something tells me that they're going to go about another chapter segment again. I don't know why, but just something tells me. But who's to say, really? Hopefully it will be open world. As to how open and as to how much it's going to be exposed to us, again, it depends on how they want to go about it, because they're still talking about whether they want to shorten them to where they can release it more often, or if they're going to elongate it to develop a better game. I'm not sure, and the team doesn't know, but we'll find out for sure in the next couple of years. Hopefully within 2 instead of like 5 that most people are assuming, but time will tell. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think is going to be the future for Final Fantasy VII Remake from here on out? I know some people are theorizing that technically the next part won't be Remake, but it will be something else. It'll be interesting because someone actually thought that it might be called Reunion, Final Fantasy VII Reunion. So that would be interesting to see that being the case. If that ends up actually being the case, where every part we get, it has a different something in the name, you know, like obviously Remake is the first one, and then of course Reunion being the second part, and who's to say what goes on from here on out? I wouldn't doubt that. We're talking about Nomura, where he's got different names for the Kingdom Hearts games themselves. So if you think I'm wrong, I don't know. Kingdom Hearts tells a different story with their names, so I wouldn't doubt that Nomura might do a Final Fantasy VII re-something. So, but anyway guys, thank you so much. See you in the next video. Catch you guys later.